is the principal facilitator for Carlton communicators who specialises in increasing the communication effectiveness and results of people, teams and organisations. His practical approach results in people more naturally, comfortably and confidently applying learning, apparently, and increasing the results and values. So let's see what he's all about, and I'd like to pass the microphone on to him.
Thank you, Sarah. Guys, welcome along to the discussion today. As the heading suggests there, we're here to look at the art of successful online communication. And as I look at that, we're going to be focusing on webinars, we're going to be focusing on seminars. Essentially, this is to do with presenting. Now, as I understand from the registrations that I had a look at and the information that you filled out, what people are generally looking for from today's discussion. If I consider what you're looking for tips, hints, how to engage. You're looking for an understanding as to how to get effective results. What I did find somewhat interesting, though not surprising, a couple of you are looking for getting a little bit more comfortable or overcoming nerves. And in 18 years of doing this, working with people in presentation skills, is one of the key things that I do tend to find that people want some assistance with. So we're going to start with an online poll. I'm going to pose the question to you. Sarah, if you bring up the poll.
Yes.
Pose the question to you with regards to your nerves. How nervous do you get before presenting? And if you answer those questions very nervous, just a little bit nervous, or not at all, you absolutely love it. And as you fill those out, I want to share with you, I started doing this 18 years ago, and prior to teaching people presentation skills, I used to be an extremely nervous presenter, was looking to get some skills, and in getting some skills or looking for some training, the guy that I started doing the work with, he offered me a job as a presenter. I don't think he realised that I was still very nervous as a presenter. I left what I was doing and became a presentation skills trainer. So how are we going with the results there, Sarah?
Great. We've got just over half, so there's the responses for you.
Okay. So if we consider the responses, 25% get very nervous, 40% get a little bit nervous, and 11% absolutely love it. And good luck to them if they do love it. I do know from my experience, the majority of people do get very nervous. I think it was Seinfeld that said in one of his shows that if we rate people's fears, the fear of presenting is above the fear of dying, in which case most people would prefer to be in the coffin than delivering the eulogy. Now, I'm going to focus on, everything that I'm going to focus on today is actually going to assist with overcoming nerves. It will increase your capacity to engage an audience and to get results. If I consider then, by way of starting, I would like to start by way of an exercise. If I can just flick to the next visual there. Sorry, before I do that. Because to me, this is about me helping you get the results, part of the housekeeping is I'm looking for you to ask questions. Yes, we're going to have question time at the end. I've got Sarah ably assisting me with regards to questions or providing me questions. I'm going to ask you as we go through, if you have any questions based on what we're touching on at the time, please feel free to ask or to clarify as we're going through. To me, this is critical about you understanding how this actually applies to you and how to get you feeling more comfortable, able to engage. Now, obviously, if I can't handle all the questions, I do only have an hour of time here. If I can't handle all the questions, people are welcome to contact me afterwards directly or via Sarah. So having said that, a bit of an exercise for you. An exercise. I'm going to ask each of you sitting at your desk if you can find a piece of paper in front of you. An A4 piece of paper. For those of you that can't find an A4 piece of paper, don't have one sitting at your desk, just imagine that you have a piece of paper. Now I'm going to give you a couple of simple directions. And we're going to see how we go with regards to following directions. I assume most people, and when I do this exercise with a live group, most people feel comfortable that they can follow a couple of simple directions. So how are we going to go with following a couple of simple directions? Can I ask you to take the piece of paper and holding it long ways, I'm going to ask you to fold that piece of paper in half long ways. Okay, so folding that piece of paper in half long ways. Once you fold it in half long ways, I want you to open that piece of paper up again and taking the top right-hand corner, I'm going to get you to take that top right-hand corner and fold it into the crease. Okay, once you've done that, I'm going to get you to take the top left-hand corner and fold that into the crease. Okay, you should end up with a bit of a point. Okay, once you've done that, I'd like you to, from the point at the top, if we trace our finger down, we come to a little bit of a corner. Take that and fold that into the crease. And then please do the same with the left-hand side. Now, some of you will be feeling somewhat confident with your capacity to follow directions. I suspect some of you will be looking at it and thinking, how did I go? Did I get it right? If I can show you what we will be looking for, essentially by way of the exercise, we were looking to fold, if I can get that in front of the camera, making a paper plane. Okay, that was the exercise. Posing the question to you then, how effective was the communication? To my understanding, I was giving you a couple of very simple instructions. And in giving you those simple instructions, to me, because they're simple, and to me, because I understand those instructions, I'm communicating to you. How were you at receiving them? They were simple to me, but maybe not to you, because if we even consider the first of those instructions, to hold the piece of paper long ways, what is long ways? Long ways can be that. Long ways can be that. Okay? Folding that piece of paper in half long ways, folding it in half long ways can be that. Folding it in half long ways can be that. So if we consider, by way of how effective was the communication, it really wasn't. And this highlights a significant issue with people when they present online, when they present in teleconferences or communicate in teleconferences. But actually I see this issue highlight constantly in formal face-to-face communications. Now, in exploring this issue, I'm going to come back to this issue through today's discussion, and we're going to explore how to address this and what we need to do to ensure that we are actually communicating effectively. Okay, so if we consider what we're going to cover today, the areas that I'd like to explore today, as was highlighted in the pre-session information, I'm breaking it down into just three key areas. We're going to look at principles to effective communication. I want to look at key planning steps to assist you in actually organising and preparing your information to maximise your results, and then some simple tips to engage and be natural. Now, I can only cover a couple of things under this. I do only have now less than an hour to go, and some would suggest that I can talk on this subject for a week, and there's many things that I'd like to share with you. I will just cover these as simply and as effectively as I can. Please, as we go through, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Sarah will indicate to me if we do have any questions as we go through. I will try and complete them as we go through, and as I said, if you do have any questions afterwards, you are most welcome to contact me. How are we going so far? Any questions?
No, just a few comments on the paper plane, as you can imagine.
What were the comments?
So some of the feedback from Tracy is that she did need feedback as she was going in order to get it correctly, which we've spoken about before. And Anne, unfortunately, hers wasn't as beautiful and purple as yours. However, she said, which I'm sure you agree with, is that it would have been nice to have been told what she was making from the start.
It would be.
Yeah.
It would be. To get a sense of an understanding as to what we're about to cover, which I'm going to explore when we look at both the principles to effective communication, when we look at the principles to effective communication and key planning steps. If I told you up front what we were building, how could I improve that communication? I could start by actually saying to you, how many people have built a paper plane before? And then, by way of the communication, I could have actually held up the piece of paper by way of instructions and folded it in half, whichever way it was going to be, to actually give you a better understanding. That's the beauty of doing a webinar, where you actually do get to have that camera to communicate more effectively visually to people. So let's get into principles to effective communication. Key things that I wanted to look at by way of the principles. I'm going to touch on just three. There are many things that I could touch on. Three key principles. Firstly, by way of webinars, teleconferences, presentations, what are they? I want to look at delivery, natural versus formal. And I also then want to look at how do audiences receive information. Let's start then by way of webinars, teleconferences, presentations. What are they? If I pose this question to you, webinars, teleconference, presentations, what actually are they? Why do you do them? Well, if we consider why we do them, what are they? You usually have some information. If you've done them, or if you think of a presentation, you've got some information that you need to communicate to a specific audience. So there's usually a specific audience. There's usually a subject that you have in mind, and that you need to communicate to a group. And by way of webinars and teleconferences, it's usually to people at geographic locations that you can't get everybody. Way of success, okay? When are they successful? If we consider, as I said, it's a modem of communication to have a specific message to a specific audience, when are they successful? Well, I've seen a lot of presentations, and a lot of people think that success is when they've actually just given out the information and they didn't die from nerves during the communication. Some people think that success is based on whether or not they're entertaining. To me, success, and I want you to think about this, success is whether or not at the end of that communication, when your audience stands and they actually leave the room. So they've stepped out of the room, they've gone. Success is whether or not your audience understands the point that you wanted them to walk away with. That is success. Okay? So a webinar, teleconference, presentation, it is a modem of communication, and I want you to think about success being whether or not your audience understands the point. That is simply true measurement of a presentation success. It's actually the true measurement of any communication success, whether or not your audience understands the point. Now, if that's the measurement of success, I now want to consider, by way of effective communication, how is it achieved? I'm going to pose the question to you when we think about naturalness and we think about formality. I want you to think of a formal communication, a formal presentation. You're going to have to give a formal communication. What's the difference by way of the modem of communication or the model of communication from formal to natural? How is that different? In posing that question to many people, I get told, well, for formal, I might wear a jacket. Formal, I'm going to change the way that I talk. And if you think of that, if you do a formal communication, do you change the way that you talk? Do you tend to be a little bit more rigid? Do you tend to be a little bit more stiff in the way that you communicate? And in fact, a lot of people say if we consider natural to formal, natural feels as if it's a little bit two-way. Formal can feel as if it's one way. Does that make sense? Now, if we tend to think that formal is one way, and we go back to the plane exercise, the paper plane exercise, that was a one-way modem of communication. And how effective was it? It wasn't, was it? Effective communication, if we consider it, it is a two-way process. So if I consider, for me to communicate effectively with you, if I understand who's in the room and who am I talking with and what you want from it, the more I can understand what you want, the more I can then tailor my communication to meet your needs. Okay? So if I understand what you're after, I can therefore tailor the communication. If I then also consider that the fact that I give out information in a one-way process, not allowing you to ask questions, then I can't really tailor the communication to meet your needs. So the more I give you the opportunity for feedback, the more I can then tailor the communication to meet your needs. So the point here is effective communication is achieved by way of a two-way process. Okay? Comfortable so far? And I should check. Any questions so far?
None so far.
None so far. So the point here is by way of effective communication is a two-way process. Now that's not easy by way of a webinar. That's not easy by way of a teleconference, because from your experience and from my experience, people sit there passively. We all know when we're running a presentation, formal presentation, we all know from teleconferences and webinars, if you've been involved, we don't tend to get participation. I'm going to touch on that later. The critical point is we need to make it as much as possible two-way. So I then want to explore after effective communication. So we've touched on what are they. They're a modem of communication. True measurement is based on whether or not the audience understands the point, okay? And effective communication is a two-way process. By way of delivery, I want to look at naturalness versus formal. Now, I posed the question to you a moment ago by way of formal. How do we do it? I want to explore formal communication. I want you to imagine a scenario, okay? A couple of scenarios. You're sitting in a room and you're watching a selection of seminars or webinars. They're all formal, okay? The people presenting to you are doing it in a very formal, a very controlled manner. Essentially, they look as if they've left their personality at the door when they've sat down to start to communicate. Now, can you imagine sitting through 3 or 4 formal presentations where the person is just formally going through information? How would you feel? How's your attention span going to be? How comfortable are you going to be sitting and listening to that information? From my perspective, it's fairly boring. It's hard to listen to. It's hard to pay attention. I can imagine if you're sitting at your desk now and this was boring, you'd start looking at other things to do. And hopefully some of you haven't started doing that just yet. But I know that if I'm sitting and watching a webinar, then all of a sudden I'll start doing 2 things at once. And as I highlighted to Sarah before we started, I'm a male. Apparently I can't do 2 things at once effectively.
Impossible.
Yeah, it's not completely impossible, but I'm not good at it. So my wife would suggest. And I know my wife's not logged in, so I can get away with saying that. Okay, so formal. Now I want to put in a presentation where you feel that it's going to be formal. Why would we do formal? Why do we need to do formal? Does the audience actually expect it to be formal? I know that you will often feel that when you do it, you need to be formal. And in my experience, when I watch people present, a lot of people just automatically assume formal. But do we need to be formal? In fact, what I tend to find is, and I've worked with a lot of senior people in many different organisations, and they tend to have audiences because they're the boards, because they're the executive leadership team or the senior management team, whatever it is within your organization, once you get to that level, you tend to be banished to boring presentations for the rest of your life because everybody assumes formal. I'm actually going to get you to think about whether or not audiences would like you to be natural, to just walk in, conversationally chat with your audience. I'm going to suggest there's no need for you to be formal. Naturalness will be easier for you to achieve. Being yourself, easier for you to achieve. It's actually easier for your audience to listen to. And it's actually more engaging and more persuasive. All you need to do is to be yourself. It's that easy. But it's not. Because as much as I tell you, just simply be yourself, how many people could stand up in front of a group of 100 people and just be themselves? Why is it that we struggle to be ourselves? Why is it that we struggle to be natural? A natural, as I said, a natural delivery style, easier to listen to, easier to maintain, okay? All you need to do is to be yourself. Why is it that we struggle? I'm going to give you a scenario. I want you to imagine that you have to give a presentation that's going to go for 45 minutes. You're an industry expert. You're going to have 150 to 200 people listening to you talk for 45 minutes with 5 to 10 minutes worth of questions. You're currently 30 seconds into this presentation. Everybody is now looking at you. You've got senior management from your organization paying attention to you. You've got all friends and colleagues come having listened to you. You're 30 seconds into the presentation. What would you be most aware of at this moment in time? 30 seconds in, a presentation to the industry, 150 to 200 people. What would you be most aware of at this moment in time? If I pose that question to people, what I tend to find is most people are highly aware of themselves. When they first start communicating, they're aware of themselves, which is why you will feel nervous. High self-awareness does not make it easy to communicate. If I pose a scenario, Saturday night, you're catching up with a group of friends. Okay, imagine that you're Saturday night catching up with a group of friends. You're telling a story to 4 people. There you are telling a story. The story's going to go for 4 minutes. As you focus on telling them that story, as you tell them that story, what are you most aware of when you tell them that story? In my experience, most people are aware of their reactions. As Diane just said, as aware of their reactions, you're aware of their expressions. So when we're in our natural communication style, we tend to focus on our audience receiving the information. When we're actually in a formal or an uncomfortable situation, we tend to focus on ourselves. And that is where we struggle with regards to our communication. High self-awareness, we struggle. If I give you one quick example of where that could, again, have an impact, recently I had to go and buy another pair of running shoes. I like to do a bit of running. It's part of my exercise regime. Went to buy a pair of running shoes, and I went to, I don't know if I need to go and advertise for certain organisations. It happened to be Rebel Sport. So I went to Rebel Sport to get some running shoes. Now, they don't have one of those machines that you step on. They ask you, if you can imagine walking in a Rebel Sport to buy some shoes, they ask you to actually walk for about 15 feet, turn around and walk back, so they can actually have a look at the imprint of your feet, so they know which shoes to give you. Try and walk naturally when somebody is watching you. How natural do you feel when you walk while somebody is watching you? If it was like me, I felt somewhat retarded whilst walking just 15 feet. It didn't feel natural at all. Why? Because I was self-conscious when I did it. So my point here with regards to naturalness and formal, I'm going to suggest you don't need to be formal. When it comes to all business communication, natural is easy to achieve. It's actually more interesting to listen to. It is what your audiences want. And if you want to do it, my simple point would be, guys, get over yourselves. It's not about you. This is about your audience receiving the information. If you focus on them, and as Tracy said, their expressions, as Diane said, their reactions, as Tracy said, their faces, if you focus on them, you'll forget about yourself and you'll find that the communication is more effective. Okay, so that's the second principle. Third thing I want to look at is how do audiences receive information. And when it comes to audiences receiving information, in my experience, 18 years of doing this, I've heard a lot of presentations. And to me, most presentations are a data dump. Okay? I sit and listen to a pile of information. Now, I don't know about you, but me, how much can I remember? How much can you remember from a presentation? I can't remember a lot. What I tend to find is most people can remember a couple of key points. And yet if I think of the presentations, I get you to think of the presentations that you've heard. Do they summarize the points? When you're hearing the presentation, if they don't summarize the points, do you summarize the points? I don't summarize the points. So therefore, I'm not proactively listening. Do people proactively listening? I'm looking at how do I help people receive information. To help people receive information, to think of it, if I consider the key problems with information flow, is majority of presentations that I've listened to, there's no clear purpose or outcome. There's no clear theme, logic, or strategy, and there's too much detail. If I, by way of no clear purpose or outcome, in doing this this work with organisations, and I do a lot of presentation skills workshops, one of the questions that when I've worked with people and I've seen them do a presentation, I pose the question to them, what would be the one thing that you wanted your audience to walk away with as a result of that presentation? And in posing that question, what I find very interesting is that over 95% of the people that I talk with, the people that I'm working with, once they've just done a presentation, they're not 100% clear as to what they wanted their audience to walk away with. Now think of that. If the presenter doesn't know what they want their audience to walk away with, how do we, the audience, ever get it? If you're delivering a presentation, if you don't know what your audience is to walk away with, how are they supposed to walk away with it? Often it's by good luck, not by good management. Key things that I would suggest would be is that is not easy to follow or listen to, and it's not effective communication. If we want to be effective, key tips that I would suggest by way of principles of effective communication. One clear message, outcome, just one. We break it down into a theme or a couple of chunks of information, and each of them then have a key point. It is those that are the key points that the audience are to walk away with, that therefore prove my message or outcome. In working with my audience, and this ties into something that was indicated earlier, that up front I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you why we're communicating this. I'm going to tell you what you're going to get as a result of the communication, how we're breaking it down. Then I go through and give you the information, and then I summarize and tell you what I've told you to ensure that you walk away with that. And critically, I'm going to keep it simple and succinct. Audiences, majority of the time, don't want the detail, and in my experience, people go into way too much detail. So guys, that would be, to my thinking, the key principles. Principles sit at the foundation of effective communication. I highlighted what is a webinar, seminar, presentation. It is just a modem of communication. True measurement of success is whether or not your audience understands the point. So your focus is on making sure that they understand the point that you want them to walk away with. By way of delivery, formal, natural, get you to think about being natural. Focus on your audience receiving the information, and by way of information flow. If you can break it down, keep it simple, focus on a message. Tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. You will tend to be more effective in your communication. Now, a couple of questions. Diane asked, do I believe that there is no place for formal communication? I believe that we need to be professional. I do believe that we need to be professional, but by way of formal, what I mean by formal is, or not being formal, is that I do think we could be more natural, comfortable, and conversational. I tend to find when people are formal, they actually don't communicate as effectively. So I still need people to be professional. I still would like people to understand how to communicate professionally. Just be comfortable, conversational, and yourself. Don't leave your personality at the door. Any other questions at this stage?
Yeah, so Tracy and Anne are asking in regards to online forms of communication, so particularly webinars. So other than the polls, the handing over text tools and the chat box, so the actual functionality of a webinar, what are some other ways to keep it interactive and engaging?
Okay, well, you're jumping ahead of me here because I'm going to talk about that when we look at the delivery side of things. And there are a number of suggestions that I can make with regards to what I would refer to as direct audience involvement and indirect audience involvement. So I'll get them to hold those questions because I will actually touch on them a little bit later on. Now, guys, keep the questions coming in by way of anything to do with what we've touched on so far, anything that you want clarified, because as you'll notice, I'm going to go through and touch on the questions as we go through the process.
Perfect.
So Tracy says, okay, so she's happy that I'm going to cover those questions later. Good. Okay, now you recall that I was breaking this session down into 3 key areas. There were the principles, there's the key planning steps, and the tips to engage and be natural. I now want to have a look at what I consider are some key planning steps. If we consider, by way of the key planning steps, okay, when I have worked with most people struggle when it comes to putting together a presentation or putting together some information. How to actually go about it. And in fact, if I get you to imagine, you're sitting at your desk now, well, let's imagine that you've just finished this and you're about to go and prepare for a webinar, you're about to prepare a presentation. What I tend to find that most people do is, first thing they do is open up PowerPoint. They'll then go through and they'll find a presentation or some information that they've presented previously. They'll find the one that's closest to, and then they'll start doing a cut and paste. Now, can I say I don't have a problem with you doing a cut and paste with regard to PowerPoint or whatever visual means that you use. I just have a problem with you doing it at this moment in time. I believe that there are some more effective steps. And the steps I would suggest would be, so firstly, we need to think about our audience. Secondly, we would need to define the message that we want them to walk away with. Thirdly, we then look at the strategy to achieve that message. Fourth, we then look at the detail. And I would do that all on a piece of paper before, once I've mapped out my presentation, I would then go into my PowerPoint to put the visuals together. So let's have a look at each of these steps in a little more detail. Firstly, by way of understanding the audience. Before I start doing anything, I put myself in the shoes of the audience that I'm going to be speaking with. And I start to think about, okay, so who am I speaking with? When it comes to a presentation, if I think of teaching people presentation skills or teaching people webinars, what are the things that people really need to understand as a result? Now, when people register for this webinar, I got an understanding as to what you were after and what you wanted. Having said that, 18 years of doing this, I do tend to know what most people want anyway, and that is people actually need to feel a bit more comfortable. They want to actually know how to do a good job. What is a good job in the first place? And they want to know how to engage. A couple of other things. People will tend to feel that they speak too quickly, and they'll want to know how to slow down. They overcoming nerves. What are the key things to overcoming nerves? They just want to know how to do a good job. From your perspective, if you're going to do a webinar, stop and think, okay, so who are the people that you're talking with? Why do they want this information? Start to think about what do you want them to do or think as a result of this communication. The more that you understand about your audience, the more that you understand where they're coming from, the more that you will be able to tailor your information to meet their needs. And interestingly, if I know my audience and I can tailor my information to meet their needs, I'm actually going to be more effective and I'm going to be more comfortable. So first and foremost, by way of the planning steps, understand your audience. Okay, the second step is the why. As I mentioned previously when it came to people doing a presentation, and as I said, I'd seen many people present over 18 years. One of the key things that I notice is people aren't sure as to the one overriding point that they wanted their audience to walk away with. When you do a presentation, there is only one point that you would want your audience to walk away with. So I'll get you to think, what is that point? What is it that you want them to either think or do as a result of this communication? When they stand up and leave the room, why are you telling them this? If you can understand firstly what you want them to think or do as a result, that provides you focus. There's a second thing I'll get you to think of. It is that, what is the benefit to them? If I'm going to ask you to think or do something, that's providing me focus. But the question, what is the benefit to them, helps provide you an understanding as to why they need this information. If you can get both those two things mapped out ahead of time and just write it down as the message that you want them to walk away with. Try it as an exercise with your next presentation. Before you do anything else, write that down. And it's amazing how that provides clarity. I've done this with people who've just done a presentation. They've just finished the presentation. I've taken them through this exercise and said, write down, what did you want me to think or do, and what is the overriding benefit? And then I've said, did you get the point across to your audience? And it's amazing how many people have said, look, I sort of talked towards it, but no, I didn't quite get it. And you know, interestingly, John, if I did that now, my presentation would be so much better. So I'm going to ask you going forward, one thing that you can do to make yourself more effective in your communication is to answer the why question before you do anything else in planning. So, step number one in planning, understand your audience. Step number two is to understand the outcome. Step number three is to then map out the key things that you need to talk through. So if I'm actually going to break a presentation down, there needs to be a story, there needs to be a theme, there needs to be some sort of what I'd refer to as the strategy to enable me to get to the outcome that I've set, which is my message. So I break every presentation or every communication down into key chunks. How I've broken it down today is I'm looking at the principles, I'm then looking at the planning, I'm then looking at the delivery. Sometimes people might break it down into just the three areas that they need to talk through. If I look at certain presentations, it might be, what are we currently doing? What do we want as an outcome? What would be the strategy for us to achieve that? And therefore, how do we then achieve that? How do we implement that strategy? Key point that I'm making here is we break our information down into the key chunks and we look at the strategy before we go into the detail. Make sure your strategy is clear before you go anywhere near the detail. If you do that, and make sure that your strategy achieves your message. Think through then, listening to a presentation. I'm going to ask you to now think through a presentation that has a clear message and that is broken down into logical chunks that achieve that. Would it be fair to say that that's going to be easier to listen to? It should be much easier to listen to as opposed to just massive chunks of information. Now, the other interesting thing is when it comes to nerves, if you actually understand the story, the theme, the strategy, you're going to feel so much more comfortable and effective in talking through the information. Final thing you then do is go into the detail. Okay, so how much detail do you need? How much detail? Put yourself in the shoes of an audience. How much detail do you usually want? I know presentation, I don't want as much detail as the presenter is usually going into. So as I said earlier, keep it simple and succinct. I know a lot of people say keep it simple, stupid. I tend to be nicer to my audiences. I tend to think that they're not stupid, so I keep it simple and succinct for them. So if we keep it simple and succinct, just the facts and figures to make the point. No more, no less. Just the details. So guys, by way of a planning steps, firstly, understand your audience. If you can follow these steps, you will find that your planning of your presentations are much easier to achieve. It will reduce your preparation time. Firstly, understand your audience. Be clear who they are, what they need and want. Secondly, why are you telling them this? What do you want them to think or do as a result? Strategy, break it down into the 2 to 5 key chunks and the point that you want to make for each of those. And then the detail, just the facts and figures. If you can go through all of that and map that out, mind map your presentation before you go into your visuals, you will find that your presentation is much more effective. It's much more efficient. It's going to enable you to achieve the outcome that you want. Okay, guys, having gone through the planning steps, are there any questions that you may have?
There aren't any questions for the planning stage yet, so I think people may think of them as you move on to the next stage, and I'll be sure to let you know.
As you go through, pop them up there as I move now into the delivery. And this is where I tend to find most people want to talk or want to understand because they want to increase their effectiveness. Now, can I just say, whilst everybody wants to increase their effectiveness in delivery, and I work with a lot of people in improving their delivery, the one thing that I will always focus on in improving people's delivery is that we start with planning. If you actually want to be good in delivery, you must plan your information. Why? Because the planning steps provide focus and control in both planning and then delivery. The more control you have over your information in planning, the more effective, guys, you're going to be in your delivery. Okay, so we've gone through and we've had a look at the principles to effective communication. They sit at the foundation. Key planning steps. They actually will organise your thoughts, organise your information to enable you to be more effective in your delivery, to organise your thoughts. Finally, let's have a look at the tips to engage and be natural. Okay, tips to engage and be natural. What happens if you don't engage your audience? What happens if we leave them passively listening? I know that when I give webinars, that it is a more difficult and it's a harder medium of communication. Why? Why is it a harder medium of communication? Because you don't always get feedback from your audience. I relate that back to the communication with the plane. And I notice that some people are arriving late. You won't understand what I'm talking to by way of the plane. You may have to ask me questions about that later. But if you think through, it's harder to get engagement. It's harder to get feedback. It's hard enough in a presentation, let alone a webinar or a seminar, or a teleconference. And what happens if we don't? They're going to drift off. So let's actually consider then, how do we engage them? And a couple of things that I'm going to get you to think of here. Firstly, we're going to look at where's your spotlight. We're going to look at two-way communication. We're going to look at audience involvement. And we're going to look at pausing. Now, there's many things that I can talk about with delivery, but essentially I can only touch on these in the time that we've got. So let's start with where's the spotlight. If I get you to think back to that scenario where I had you imagine you were delivering a presentation to 150 to 200 people, and I got you to imagine that you were 30 seconds into the communication. Get you to think then, where was the spotlight? Most of you in that scenario were focusing on yourself. And if I get you to think of the spotlight being on yourself is not effective in the communication. So where does the spotlight need to be if we're communicating effectively? If you actually have a look at the most effective communicators, be it a presentation, be it a teleconference, the most effective communicators actually have the spotlight on their audience, understanding the point that they are making. It just increases the emphasis, it increases the impact, it increases the way that they communicate. So I'm going to get you to think going forward when you're delivering. When you start communicating, don't focus on yourself, focus the spotlight on the audience that you're talking with, understanding the point that you are making, first and foremost. Okay? Focusing on the audience, focus the spotlight on the audience. Then as we add to that, tips to engage. If I start to focus on the audience, or if you start to focus on, if you're doing a webinar, if you start to focus on us as the audience, automatically that starts to change the way that you communicate. If you think of the way that you communicate, it then starts to become more two-way. Now, whilst your audience can't respond as quickly, the fact that you are communicating with them two-way actually feels as if it's a little bit more engagement, and it changes. If you think of the way that it might change little things that you do in your communication. The little things that you do in your communication, I'm going to refer to as indirect audience involvement. I'm going to touch on them shortly. There was the question as to, well, how do we get the audience involved? We can, in a webinar or a seminar, we can do direct involvement, and that is the polling of the audience. Are there certain questions, certain things that you might want to understand? And that's where we have the very able Sarah sitting beside us, who she doesn't like to go on screen. And I've teased her by saying that I can grab the computer and swing it around so that you can all see what she looks like, and she doesn't want me to do that. She's going to slap me if I do that. What we can do is polling. So you think through ahead of time, what are the sorts of questions that you might need to ask from your audience? Now, I know the questions that I need to know from the audience, so I can relate the information to them. So to me, it's ask the questions throughout. Get them to engage throughout. Get the audience to ask questions throughout. If you think through how I set up at the start, I'm not waiting for questions till the end. I'm asking the audience, the participants, to ask questions all the way through the presentation, all the way through the communication. And then I could also ask questions of specific audience members. So if I want to relate a question specifically to some of the audience members, so Ryan Rossnaro, who keeps on losing his connection. My apologies, Ryan, but if I wanted to ask Ryan a question specifically, I could do that. Or there's Mike Wingfield, who is actually listening to the communication, and to get him to provide some feedback. I know that I've worked with Michael in the past, and it was his suggestion that I come in because of how much help I had provided him in doing his previous presentations. So if I actually consider, I can refer to specific audience members to have them feel involved and get them involved. And Mike's come back and said, made me laugh, made me cry, changed my life. Aww. Thanks, Mike, for the lovely feedback. Okay. And the other thing that I can do is get the audience to do something. So if you consider the paper plane exercise, where I did get you to fold a piece of paper, as I do it in front of the camera, folding a piece of paper. Getting an audience to do anything is getting them to be involved. Now that's direct audience involvement, and that's what we normally try to do, but that's not easy. If we think of it, is that really easy in a presentation? No, it's not. So what are some of the other ways that we can involve the audience? And this, guys, is the gems. This is how you make a presentation, this is how you make a webinar very, very effective. And it is indirect audience involvement. What is indirect audience involvement? Indirect audience involvement is when we do something that actually has your audience switch on and pay attention. So if we consider the first one there, posing a rhetorical question. What happens when I pose a rhetorical question? Well, I just did. And when I did that, Sarah's now laughing at me as she realised what I just did. When I pose a rhetorical question, you then actually start to think through the answer. So therefore your brain's switched on. Now, guys, how often can you pose rhetorical questions? There you go, I just posed another rhetorical question. You can actually pose questions all the way through the communication. It actually feels, when you do this, it feels as if it's far more two-way communication as opposed to one-way communication. If you're doing a webinar, if you're doing a presentation, I would get you to think about the sorts of questions that your audience are going to have ahead of time, and don't wait for them to ask. Pose the questions on their behalf. The rhetorical questions are a fantastic tool to make it feel two-way. Secondly, I want you to think about giving examples. Okay? So if we think through giving an example of a webinar, getting you to think about a specific webinar where, if I give an example of a webinar where you're part of the audience, okay? You're sitting in a room listening to a webinar. That is what I would refer to as a first-person example, where you're actually involved listening and imagining what it's like falling asleep listening to some boring person go on and on. It makes sense that you're therefore participating. I want you to think through, you're giving a presentation 30 seconds in. 150 people as your audience. Notice what I did there was to get you involved as an example, to get you to imagine a scenario, to get you to think about how you felt. That, as an exercise, has your audience involved indirectly. It is a very effective tool for engaging and involving your audience. Refer to knowledge of them. Okay? What would the knowledge be? You will know certain things about the people that you're talking with. When I consider the audience when it comes to presentations or communication skills, I know that most people get nervous. And I know how the nerves unfold. I also know what to do when it comes to nerves. My thoughts would be, get the audience involved within the first 2 minutes of your presentation. I always do it because it helps me overcome my nerves. And relate the information to them as best as possible. Now, guys, when it comes to indirect or direct audience involvement, this is where you guys have the most questions. So I'm going to ask, are there any queries, any ideas, any thoughts that you would now like to understand as a result of what we're talking about? This is where you get to ask all your questions. None as yet?
Yes.
Yeah?
Well, firstly, I think if all else fails, Glenn's made a good point. You can just advise your audience to always have good coffee lying around.
Yes.
Hey?
Yeah.
So there's a tip for some of you.
That always helps for the presenter as well.
Yeah, exactly. So this question's come up from Anne, and she's more talking about the direct involvement. So given that you can't read a room in a webinar, how flexible do you need to be in adapting your webinar content? So say, for example, Anne and Tracy are keen on the technical delivery part of a presentation. So could you then poll people to ask them which part of the presentation they would like to jump to?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that would always be poll people ahead of time. To me, before I walk into a room, I like to have a good understanding as to who the audience are, what their needs are. So don't ever underestimate the value of posing questions to an audience ahead of time. I know that if I'm going to actually be running a workshop or running certain seminars, I actually send out questionnaires to certain audience members ahead of time so I know what they want, and that way I can tailor it to it. Now, do that ahead of time, and then my thoughts would be do minor polling, minor questioning throughout. I tend to suggest that would help you feel more comfortable and effective and be better tailored at the start of a communication rather than try and get the questions and the tailoring throughout.
Yep.
And hopefully that'll answer the question. If it doesn't, come back to me and indicate.
And from Glenn, so John, what's been your best experience and why?
best experience, and I've had
listening to yourself.
I hate guys. Similar to everybody else, I hate listening to myself. I don't enjoy seeing myself on camera, so it's got nothing to do with me. My best experience. I have been doing this for 18 years, and there are so many different experiences. My best experiences tend to come from the reaction that I get from the audience. And when they come back to me and say that what I said was very helpful within their presentations, when they come back and say that, look, I used what you said and that was very effective. Now, because I focus on my audience, it actually helps me to feel more comfortable. So, interestingly, my best experiences aren't about me. My best experience is about the reaction of the audience.
What about in terms of public speaking? So have you seen an excellent public speaker that you think is just out of this world? And if so, what makes them so appealing and engaging? What makes them appealing and engaging?
If you were actually to go through and have a look at the recent presidential presentations from Bill Clinton, from Obama, if you actually have a look at them, they're very comfortable. They're very natural. They take their time and they relate the information to their audience. And that they are, to me, fantastic public speakers. I don't tend to believe that Australian politicians do, and sorry if there's any politicians out there, I don't tend to find that they are as effective, and a lot of the time it's because they are trained to stage and manufacture the communication. And this is on both sides of politics, but if we actually consider too often, they use if I was to say very staged, manufactured, I'm doing this intentionally now with my hand gestures, very staged, manufactured gestures. Their gestures aren't natural. They come across as staged and manufactured. It lacks sincerity and it lacks credibility. So they've got a very staged performance delivery, as opposed to when people are more natural, they're easier to listen to. That would be one of the key things that I would suggest. And if you want to be natural, as I said, focus on your audience receiving the information, as opposed to being aware of yourself giving out the information.
There's actually an interesting video, which I'll post in a second, of Gina Reinhart's speech. Did you see that?
Yeah.
An example of not what to do?
Of not what to do. She actually, I wouldn't have recommended her to go through and do that information in the first place. From a PR perspective, I don't think that information was anywhere near effective for her. I do think that people, the more natural they are, the more effective. And I noticed that Glenn did excerpt Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. If I think of Paul Keating when it came to the press club, he would stand up and deliver a very formal speech, which was, Paul Keating wasn't at his most effectiveness. If you ever watched him speak, if you can remember him speaking, he wasn't at his most effectiveness at giving that sort of a chat. He was most effective at question time, where he would relax and just comfortably, conversationally cover information and then even tear the opposition to shreds. Other questions at this stage?
Glenn, as well, so in terms of pictures and photos in use of these presentations, any comments?
Pictures?
Photos?
By way of visuals, the one thing I would say is keep them simple. Too many people put information up there to have all their notes, okay? You put pressure on yourself to therefore talk to your visuals. Your visuals should be clear and simple. They shouldn't have too much information on them. Pictures are fantastic. If you're going to have bullet points up there, listen to the word bullet point, okay, or the words bullet point. Short, sharp. It's not bullet sentences, it's bullet points. They need to be short and sharp, okay? Just a couple of words, doesn't need to be clear. It doesn't need to be busy. It needs to be clear and simple.
There seems to be a few comments and discussions going on, which is great, and I'm going to hand it over to John to wrap it up. But before I do, for those of you who do need to take off, we do understand we have held your interest for an hour now, which is great. So if you do need to jump off, please click on the exit button on the top right-hand corner. And as mentioned earlier, upon completion of the satisfaction survey, we will send you a recording of the webinar.
And for those of you that are logging off, if you do have any questions, you're most welcome to contact me directly with specific issues, specific questions, specific needs. I'm always happy to assist.
Exactly, and we'll also put the contact details for John in the follow-up email, so you can hassle him as much as you like.
Yep.
Most okay?
Yep.
I should have covered that off beforehand.
Yeah. You're most welcome to hassle me. I do know that Kathy Hadlow has put up a question with regards to, is it possible to animate slides or show videos? Unfortunately, on webinars, it's not, because otherwise I would have much more animated visuals. I want you to keep in mind that if you are using an animated visual, why, and does it assist or does it detract? Put yourself in a room, you're watching a presentation, the presenter is speaking, and the visual is being animated. Where's your focus? Are you listening to the presenter, or are you listening or watching the animation? Now, obviously, if it's a video, that can be fine, but I tend to find people put things up on their visuals to distract them.
Yeah. And basic animations like we've done here today are fine. The pop-up bullet points.
Pop-up bullet points. All basic animations are very effective.
Yeah, and videos, as Sarah mentioned, are also able to be shown, but once again, consideration.
Now, guys, just while we think of that, there is one other point that I want to make by way of effective communication, and it is one of the things that the majority of people struggle with when it comes to communication, and that is pausing. In my experience, people talk non-stop when they have the opportunity to present. They speak too quickly. And I hear it time and time again, people say, oh, look, I speak too quickly. I want you to understand that when you say that, you're not actually speaking too quickly. Chances are you're not stopping. When we communicate day to day, we actually punctuate by way of pauses, by way of full stops. And yet when we put a spotlight on ourselves, we naturally feel the need to continue talking. Pausing and just getting used to pausing is a wonderful tool. Now, pausing, once you get used to doing it, it's not easy to do. Pausing adds to your naturalness. The more you start to pause and breathe, the more natural you feel. The more natural you feel, the more you pause. The more you pause, the more natural you feel. You build on it. I noticed that Glenn Frost speaking too quickly, except Julia Gillard. Julia, I would actually say, from my personal perspective, does actually speak non-stop. I believe, personal opinion, I believe she could enhance the effectiveness of her communication through greater punctuation. If she wants to chat to me at any stage to get some training, I'm very happy to assist her. I personally believe just that little bit more punctuation and that little bit more naturalness would significantly enhance her communication style. So they would be, just as we move towards wrapping up, they would be my key tips that in the only time that I've got available, spotlight should be on the audience. Communication should be two-way. Talk with people. Talk with the audience. Focus on them, not talking at them. Talk with them, not at them. Audience involvement. Engage them, be it direct or indirect. And for webinars, it is indirect audience involvement is a very powerful tool. And finally, pausing. Breathe and break the flow. Okay? They're some fantastic tips. The overriding thing to me when you're doing it is don't feel that this is a formal thing. The more that you are natural, focus on your audience understanding and receiving the information, the more effective you are going to be in the communication process. So, guys, that is really the key things within the limited time that I've had to go through. Understand the principles to effective communication. They sit at the foundation. Okay? Planning steps. If you plan your information effectively, it will significantly enhance your communication and enable you to be more effective in delivery. And when it comes to delivery, my overriding suggestion is always be natural. Focus on your audience. Make it two-way. You'll feel more comfortable. They'll actually find it easier to listen to. So if you need to switch off, I do understand. Any further questions and answers, very happy to sit here for as long as you want and handle them. Or if that's it, I'm happy to wind it up. I'll go to Sarah now to suggest what we're going to do from here.
Great. So just one quick comment from Carol, and she said that she's found that there can be an exception regarding PowerPoint slides. So, for example, she works in the dentistry field, so people who are presenting those webinars are actually educating the audience. So they actually need to use those pictures to actually talk through what's happening with the teeth and then also present the outcome. So
Carol,
I think...
Carol, my suggestion to that would, and this is where a lot of people have issues with regards to their visuals, are you using your visuals as a handout? Because I agree that if you're educating, you may want to make sure that people have enough information for them going forward. By way of a visual, the more that we can keep them simple, the less reading people will need to do. And the idea will be, if my visuals are busy, as I'm talking with you, can you effectively do two things at once? And as I highlighted earlier, I can't. I have to make a decision. Do I read the visual or do I listen to the person talking? I can't do two at once. So to me, I keep my visuals simple. My handouts I can have as more detail. And I want everybody to keep in mind that a visual and a handout, they're actually two separate communication tools. And the more that we understand that, the more effectively we can use them as communication tools.
Great.
Any other questions?
Just a quick one from Maxine. So any tips for presenting an interview with an expert on the subject?
To present in an interview with an expert?
Yeah, so having a webinar and maybe you're the interviewer and I'm the interviewee. Anything differently that you should do in that environment?
Anything. There's a lot that I can, and you're welcome to contact me directly. If you're presenting to an expert, and a lot of people, this gets into handling questions. A lot of people feel that they should know everything to do on a subject to be comfortable. I hear a lot of the time, well, what happens if I get asked a question that I don't know? I feel as if I don't know everything on the subject. My thoughts will be, you know enough. Let me go back. Firstly, if you're about to go through and present on a subject, know enough to achieve the outcome. Okay? Goes back to the message. What is the outcome? All you need to know is enough to achieve the outcome. You don't need to know everything, just enough to achieve the outcome. So I only need to know enough on this subject to talk for an hour, technically, and therefore handle a couple of questions after that. So only enough to achieve the outcome. When I'm talking to somebody who's a specialist in an area, I'm comfortable that they know more than me. I only need to know as much as I need to know and can acknowledge that the person that I'm talking with knows more. And if you can be comfortable that you know enough just to handle the questions and to explain what you're there for, that will enable you to speak more effectively. You do not need to be an expert. Hopefully that answers the question, and if it doesn't, please come back to me and clarify questions afterwards. Any other questions?
Yeah, one final question. So this one's from Melina. And any tips for training webinars? So, for example, training someone on software as a presenter.
Training webinars. I tend to find when it comes to training, the more that people can do something. This ties into Confucius saying, tell me and I hear, show me and I can see, get me to do it and I understand. And I think get me to do it and I understand was added much later than Confucius. His original quote was, tell me and I hear, show me and I can see. If I wanted to teach you to do something, me telling you how to do it, and I do appreciate within a webinar it's limited, me telling you how to do something really doesn't take you through the experience. Me showing you how I do it gives you a sense of what goes on, but it really doesn't take you through the experience. To train somebody effectively, we need to get people to do it. So when you're training, if you can get people to actually go through and do something, you're actually going to help them with the learning process. So break modules down into getting people to do something, participate, and then have the discussion afterwards. If you can do that with each model, you'll actually get much more effective outcomes. Elena, hopefully that answers the question.
Excellent. Well, that about wraps it up, I think.
Perfect. Guys,
great.
Thank you for your attention, assuming that you're still paying attention. And as I said, if anybody has any questions, you are most welcome to contact me for me to clarify things that I've said afterwards.
Great.
Guys, good luck with your webinars. Thanks.
Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.